Okay, welcome to everybody here to the Stalin Society. We are going to talk today about reform or revolution with specific reference to the Second International. As you know, this was really the first big disaster of the international communist.
You're not going to give my presentation, are you? Just fucking don't do it. Don't give in to temptation. I've got little enough to say as it is. Leave it alone.
Don't promise them a little when it's a lot, because they'll start getting tired after 2 minutes.
Oh, I can go on all day, don't I?
So anyway, without further ado, that being the case, here's Ranjeet to give you his thoughts, and after vast amounts of research that he's done on the topic.
Thank you very much, Ella. So my vast amounts of research fundamentally amounted to reading Lenin on the question. Lenin obviously has written a lot. And if you imagine that the war years run from 1914 to 1918, and in the middle of that the October Revolution happens, and then they're straight into the Civil War. But the entire run-up also to the First World War, and a lot of Lenin's works are dealing with the question really of the split in socialism and its different manifestations. And the collapse of this, I guess we should really start with the title. So I've called it Reform or Revolution, because this was fundamentally the lines along which the international socialist movement split. The possibility, the prospects, but the actual duty of carrying out a revolution when a revolutionary situation presented itself. And leading up to that, the preparations of the different outlook that led to those different perspectives. Lenin, at the time of the collapse of the Second International, insisted on going back to the official manifestos, if you like, the resolutions passed by the congresses of the International that led up to the war, and pointing out the words that the entire international socialist movement had unanimously subscribed to before the war, and saying that these are the forgotten words of socialism. And really, I think it's a very good point to come back to. So the forgotten words of socialism and the collapse of the Socialist International. The most left and arch-revolutionary resolutions and the most shameless forgetfulness or renunciation of these resolutions are one of the most striking manifestations, he said, of the International's collapse. The party has a great pamphlet on World War I, the characterization of World War I and why it happened. We've just passed through, I guess we're passing through the years of the 100th anniversary of the war. It was a 4-year war. So again, I guess in 1918, there'll be another fanfare and more bourgeois propaganda really about the causes of the war, how we should remember it, how we sleepwalked into the war, how it wasn't really our fault, how it's basically the Germans' fault. I mean, still basically, these are the lines that are being put forward. For that reason alone, it's worth revisiting the topic. But also, there's a much more fundamental question about the way we pursue socialist tactics in an imperialist country and an imperialist-dominated world, which was decided at that point and still affects us very much today. So World War I was a crucible, if you like, that drew lines in the modern socialist movement that remain with us until today. The Triple Entente, so Germany, Austro-Hungary versus the Triple Alliance of Britain, France and Russia, drew over 20 states into the conflagration of war, and 30 nations, in fact, into war. And it was described classically as a charnel house, and this is what we remember if you look back on the poets of the war, or the images of the war, mass mechanized trench warfare in which millions of men, sometimes hundreds of thousands of men on a single day, died in these great battles, Ardennes, the Somme, words which still have such resonance today. So probably 40 million soldiers and civilians directly involved in the conflict died in the war. But then, of course, because of the devastation it caused economically, because of the high levels of malnutrition, there were epidemics that followed the war as well. So Spanish influenza epidemic killed something between 50 and 100 million people after the war. Typhus and lice accounted for perhaps another 10 million. And actually, if you read some bits of Lenin's writings around the October Revolution, interspersed with proclamations about the Civil War, there are proclamations about lice. And you think, well, that's kind of madness. But actually, it was a huge epidemic of lice and disease that accompanied war. It's the classic fourth horseman of the apocalypse. Wilfred Owen, has got a poem that's worth it's worth just revisiting, just to kind of picture, if you like, how the war imprinted itself upon just the consciousness of ordinary people who otherwise wouldn't have been roused to any kind of higher socialist sentiment or anti-war sentiment. He said, so 4 days the earth was rent and torn by bursting steel. The houses fell about us. 3 nights we dared not sleep, sweating and listening for the imminent crash, which meant our death. The 4th night every man, nerve-tortured, racked to exhaustion, slept, muttering and twitching, while the shells crashed overhead. The 5th day, there came a hush. We left our holes and looked above the wreckage of the earth, to where the white clouds moved in silent lines across the untroubled blue. Some very powerful images of, this really was mechanized extermination. You know, like you sat in your trenches, waited for your orders, thought about the mismanagement of the war, and then were just asked to go over the edge and sacrifice yourself. And in this circumstance, you know, the question of whether or not you want to obey those orders, whether you want to mutiny, whether you follow the line of the international bourgeoisie who are leading you to your slaughter, really comes to the fore and creates, you know, a terrible situation for the world, but also profound opportunities for change and to get rid of that system that had led to that point. And the socialist movement had seen the war coming and had prepared the ground for opposition. But at the outbreak of the war, it became clear that due to the split into 2 great camps, in most countries, there was an ideological split which wasn't accompanied by an organizational split, and that paralyzed the revolutionary wing of social democracy. In particular, the German Social Democrats, who had a party that had some 1 million members in the SDP, Social Democratic Party of Germany, you know, who were thought to be the leaders of the International, with such theoreticians as Karl Kortzy had been respected as, you know, champions of revolutionary Marxism for many years, really betrayed the revolutionary standpoint of socialism, and Lenin was very fierce and vehement in pointing this out and redrawing the lines. There were 2 questions, really, which came up again and again in the different platforms of the different parties, of the different contending nations in the war. And they were the question of imperialism, so the correct understanding of imperialism, and actually how to characterize this current conflict. The bourgeoisie of each nation constantly asserted this is a national war, it's a war of self-defense, it's a war in which we're just, it's a righteous war, and they looked at those examples to justify it. And actually a section of the social democrats, the right-wing opportunist social democrats that Lenin characterized as social chauvinists, went along with that ultimately. They tried to justify the war, prettify the war, and acted as a social prop of their own imperialist governments fighting the war. So the question of imperialism, Lenin's writings are full of. And ultimately, of course, he wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which he wrote literally on the eve of the Russian Revolution. And then the other question was the question of the state and revolution. And actually seizing the opportunity to take a revolutionary road when it came. So it was this that led to the insertion of internationalism, the desertion of internationalism and the adoption of chauvinism by actually the majority of European socialists. It was this correct understanding, by contrast, and an early organizational breach with opportunism in Russia that allowed Lenin and the Bolsheviks to adopt a correct revolutionary internationalist standpoint, call for the revolutionary defeat of Tsarism and then the Russian bourgeoisie, encourage fraternization in the trenches. But it was these diametrically opposed lines coexisting within a single body that led to the dramatic collapse of the Second International. It was this then also that led Lenin, the fact that they had not only a theoretical understanding but an organizational breach very early on, that they were able to take advantage of a revolutionary situation when it came, that allowed Lenin and the Bolsheviks to rally around them, a group capable of carrying out the Russian Revolution, but also to begin to reinstitute on a revolutionary basis a new international, which became the third international, under which, let us not forget, all major achievements really of the socialist and of the communist movement have been achieved in the 21st century. So this fundamental question, reform or revolution, is one that is with us absolutely today in Britain. And it's worth just very quickly having a glance over the current political climate as we see it, particularly after the 2017 election, in which Labour Party has done better than expected with this apparently unprecedented left-wing leader and tremendous amount of kind of faith and hope of all kinds of disparate elements who really have no exposure to socialist politics or much politics in general, and a tremendous amount of hope and faith they place in this Labour Party vehicle led by a left-wing leader. So currently, obviously, we have a social democratic Labour Party, but it's cloaked by an increasingly indistinguishable bloc of people I would characterise as the fake left. And interestingly, it's a characterisation, the pseudo-socialist or fake left is one that's as old as the collapse of the Second International. This is how they were characterised. And really, there's this fake left bloc around the Labour Party. Obviously, the Labour Party stand for reform. I don't think anyone would claim, well, the right wing claim that the right wing of the Tories claim, in paradoxical, kind of almost joking, in an ironical fashion, that Corbyn is some kind of Bolshevik or Marxist. But really, they stand for capitalism, they stand for the city, they don't seriously oppose imperialism. They stand for reform. They've been pointed out that by some that they think Corbyn stands for the refoundation of old Labour. Personally, I don't see any distinction between new and old Labour. But certainly, what's particularly interesting on that score is if you look at the words penned by Tony Blair's rewriting of Clause 4, when he got rid of the pledge, which had always been honoured in the breach rather than the observance of the Labour Party, which was a Clause 4 pledge that was going to renationalise or nationalise the means of production, distribution, exchange. They got rid of that, and they said instead they were going to have a party and a country that was for the many, not the few. They're very kind of blind. And this was something over which Arthur Scargill left the Labour Party and started the SLP. This was something over which Trotskyists said this is a total break with the traditions of the Labour Party. In fact, it was nothing of the kind. But it's interesting to note that this alleged very left-winger who's we're told is refounding, old Labour, actually is fighting his election manifesto on the words of the revised Clause 4, rather than, so even by his own standards, it's the right-wing manifesto of the party. All right. Around that, obviously, you have the trade union movement, which stands for Labour and is a very organic link with the Labour Party. It doesn't have a separate programme, really. We've got revisionist socialists. So we've got the CPGB, who stand for, in practice, reform, parliament, Labour as the mass party of the working class. They do this on the basis of saying Labour is organically collected with the working class and therefore is a mass party of the working class. And even that Lenin told us, the CPB, not CPGB, you're quite right. Even that Lenin told us, CPGB as it was, CPB as it is now, Lenin told us that we should vote Labour. Lenin, if you read his works, if you read entire volumes of his, even selected works, like 3 volumes of his selected works, are a veritable panegyric against right-wing reformist socialism, about how these people, how it's become a stinking corpse, how they've sold out the revolutionary movement, claim that Lenin himself is the one who's pushing them to vote for reformist Labour. But that's them anyway. NCP have a similar position. I mean, they're a small organisation now, but essentially they have exactly an indistinguishable position, actually, that Lenin told us to vote Labour, that, that they're organised section of the working class. And the Trotskyites, of course, of Socialist Party, who basically say reform, parliament, Labour as the mass party of the working class, left pressure and a general strike. And this has become a general manifesto that's given not by the Socialist Party, by the SWP, by Counterfire, and then there's a Scottish Socialist Party who have a similar line, but they substitute the SNP now for Labour Party. So, in addition to that, you have the single-issue mass campaigns of Stop the War and C&D, who all essentially have forgiven Corbyn for wanting to lead imperialist war, drop the nuclear bomb, use extrajudicial assassination of drones, still accept and cheerlead. So very much the question of reformist attitude absolutely dominates the landscape, if you like, of British politics today. Coming back to the International, the Second International, of course, was the reconstitution after the First International. First International was the International Working Men's Association, which was founded by Marx and Engels and had a lot of adherents in mid to late 19th century. So it was 1866 to 72, and they held 5 congresses. But ultimately, Marx dissolved the International, saying there wasn't sufficient maturity of the working class parties to justify its continued existence, that the parties themselves hadn't developed to the point where they were capable of revolutionary association and developing a revolutionary line. They included Bakunin, the anarchists, Lassallean petty bourgeois socialists. There's a real admixture of different lines and trends. The Second International was formed in Paris on July the 14th, 1889, and it ran from 1889 until midway through the war. It was officially dissolved, but effectively it ceased to exist with the advent of the First World War on August the 4th, 1914. So it was led by Emile van der Velde and Camille Huysmans of the Belgian Labour Party. And Lenin was its member from 1905, and he attended several of its key congresses and writes very beautifully about its declarations, its significance, and also then about its collapse and betrayal. When it first, among the famous actions of the Second International are its 1889 declaration of the 1st of May to be International Workers' Day, Labour Day, of 19th March, and then later the 8th of March to be International Working Women's Day, and it famously initiated the struggle for the 8-hour working day. At its 6th Congress in Paris, it had over 24 representatives, principally from France, but actually from around Europe and the United States. And parties from Britain included the Socialist League, the Socialist Labour Party, and the Bloomsbury Socialist Society, who I presume had Deborah Lavin as one of their firm adherents. And then they had a number of congresses, 7th, 8th, 9th in Brussels, Zurich, London, 10th in Paris in 1900, 11th in Amsterdam, 1904. And then I really want to focus a little bit on the 12th and the 14th in particular. So the 12th was the Stuttgart Conference, which ran from the 18th to the 24th of August, 1907. It had almost 886 delegates in attendance. Again, more than 25 nations. And if I just read through a few of them, there are names that you'll know. So from Austria, there was Victor Adler. Belgium, still Emile van der Velde. From France, Jules Guesde, Gustave Herve, Jean Jaurès, and Edouard Vaillant. From Germany, are the ones that are most famous, if you like, the ones that we'll all know: August Bebel, Edward Bernstein, Edward David, Hugo Haas, Karl Korzicki, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Franz Mehring, Paul Singer, Clara Zetkin. From Great Britain, Henry Hindman, of the British Socialist Party, who was not only a famous opportunist, but distinguished himself by being the first, really, to desert to the side of imperialism as early as 1911. Ramsay MacDonald of the ILP, and of course the Labour Party, who was a well-known opportunist and social chauvinist. Harry Quelch of the Social Democratic Federation, who I wasn't aware of. Do you guys know Harry Quelch?
Yeah, he ran a printing press in what's now Mark Memorial House. And in fact, he's the one who hosted Lenin's trip to London when he was publishing East Coast.
So, and actually Lenin wrote a lovely little obituary for him because he died soon after the war. But he was clearly a kind of, not only working class, but a passionate revolutionary socialist who, exactly right, not only had a close association with Lenin in the years he was in London, but found a printing press that he hived off in some relatively secret corner of a works, and he produced Iskra. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but he produced Iskra, and it was smuggled from here, where Lenin was editing it, back into Russia. So very interesting. But he was a delegate for many conferences, but he was there in this conference as well, in the 12th conference at Stuttgart. George Bernard Shaw, playwright, and sadly also, very mixed in his politics, but he essentially did become an opportunist. From India, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, recognize that name from previous presentations. From the Netherlands, Van Kool. From Russia, Lenin, Lunacharsky, Litvinov. USA, I'm not really familiar with many of them. But anyway, a large and really august body of socialists who gathered to discuss questions of importance to all international socialists at that time. And Lenin wrote about it warmly, and he said, the great importance of the International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart lies in the fact that it marked the final consolidation of the Second International and the transformation of International Congress into business-like meetings which exercise very considerable influence on the nature and direction of socialist activities throughout the world. Formally, the decisions of the International Congress were not binding on the individual nations, but their moral significance is such that the non-observance of decisions is in fact the exception, which is rarer than the non-observance by the individual parties of their own congresses. So it was becoming a really functioning international, in other words, in which important questions were discussed and considered seriously, and the debate was listened to, and the decisions were generally, he thought, observed by the parties involved. The Stuttgart Congress made a big stride forward in the same direction, and on a number of important issues proved to be the supreme body determining the political line of socialism. The Stuttgart Congress, more firmly even than the Amsterdam Congress, laid this line down in the spirit of revolutionary social democracy as opposed to opportunism. They did notice, and he wasn't the only one to notice, Clara Zetkin also observed in this connection, that on all questions, the various deviations of certain socialist parties towards opportunism were corrected in a revolutionary sense with the cooperation of the socialists of all countries. However, the remarkable and sad feature in this connection was that German social democracy, which hitherto had always upheld the revolutionary standpoint of Marxism, proved to be unstable or took an opportunist stand. So already 1907, fully 7 years before the war, Germany was showing that it was developing a very strongly opportunist wing of its party, and an opportunist line was becoming dominant. So in Amsterdam, writes Clara Zetkin's journal, the revolutionary leitmotif of all the debates in the Parliament of the World Proletariat, the International, was the Dresden Resolution. In Stuttgart, a jarring opportunist note was struck by Volmar's speeches in the Commission on Militarism, by Puplow's speeches in the Emigration Commission, and by David's, and we would add Bernstein's, that's Lenin's speeches, in the Colonial Commission. On this occasion, in most of the commissions and on most issues, the representatives of Germany were leaders of opportunism. I'm just going to very briefly, they're small excerpts from the different questions they considered. It's remarkable how the questions they considered then are very similar to the questions that we face now in terms of immigration, in terms of the colonial question, or basically imperialist war, and of course on militarism for them, because they saw already at that point the impending crisis, the conflict which was economic at that point, but more and more the dominant theme that countries were not only economically coming into collision with each other over the question of colonies, but were increasingly preparing and gearing up for this massive conflagration that was clearly coming. So on the colonial question, Lenin had a whole series of writings in which he pointed out that formally the question of the right of nations was mainly considered from the point of view of small European nations, Ireland, Poland, Finland. But increasingly, Lenin's line and the international was recognizing that the entire colonial, the non-white colonial population, who were considered totally differently. And if you look, I looked at Clement Attlee's book, The Labour Party in Perspective, briefly, and the language makes you almost sick, actually, when he talks about the non-white races, the yellow race, the black race, the brown race, the childlike races, the colonial races, who clearly, the less developed races, he says it like that, not nations, not less developed races, so it's an implicit, assumption of genetic superiority of the Europeans and the European stock, and the totally separate way in which the Australians, even the South Africans, though there are difficult questions there of apartheid, basically, right, and colonialism. Basically, there's an assumption that the Europeans are fundamentally different, and already in the imperialist countries, whose bourgeoisie have a very clear economic stake in suppressing and exploiting colonies, you can see that chauvinistic attitude reflected in the working class movement very clearly. The working class leaders, and especially the opportunist wing of the working class leaders, who, I mean, Clement Attlee's book is written before the Second World War, and even then, he's basically saying, of course, when we were in opposition and we had no prospect of getting into power, it was very easy to write critically about, to view imperialism from a purely critical standpoint. But, now that we're in power, we see that, yes, we conquered by blood and sword, and that was obviously negative. 50 years ago, it was very bad. But, in the last 50 years, because of humanitarianism and radical socialism and a religious standpoint, administrations become much, much better, and they're complex questions, and it's kind of all this pettifogging to basically cover up the fact that, and even if you read a bit later on, he then says, if you look actually, it's the Tories who are losing empire with their poor policy, so they become absolute defenders of empire. We're better at defending the empire than the Tories are, and they're complex questions, and we take our socialist duties seriously in raising these nations to civilization, but very much they prove themselves to be defenders and servitors of imperialism. So on the colonial question, there's a very brief note that Lenin wrote, but it's worth visiting. He said, on the colonial question, an opportunist majority was formed in the Commission, and the following monstrous phrase appeared in the draft resolution. The Congress does not, in principle and for all time, reject all colonial policy, which under a socialist regime may have a civilizing effect. Yeah. So, in reality, this proposition was tantamount to a direct retreat towards bourgeois policy and a bourgeois world outlook that justifies colonial wars and atrocities, writes Lenin, absolutely rightly. Ramsay MacDonald distinguished himself by being a representative who spoke up for the civilizing, possibilities of colonialism and empire. And the Webbs were famous for saying, of course, well, fundamentally, what's the point of having an empire if you don't have an imperial race capable of civilizing the minorities, So, coming to trade unions, there was a debate about the importance of merging social democratic politics with the union movement, which was pretty much passed overwhelmingly. Interestingly, it was Fabians who opposed that and said they should be kept separate. So a woman's and similarly on the question of women's suffrage, it was Fabians and a woman Fabian who said that really we should only be seeking for the vote for women with a certain degree of property rather than universal property. But these were opportunist suggestions, which were clearly trends, which were cast aside, and they passed pretty good resolutions. Immigration and emigration was already a question that was dominating the mind. So once you have a colonial empire, once you have a section of the world which lives by exploiting another section of the world, the question of elevating the standard of life of, as Engels had said, of creating an aristocracy of labour, a group of the workers who do relatively well from the crumbs of imperialism. And even though they're workers, they have a certain stake, not really a full stake, but a certain stake, a few crumbs of privilege that come to them. And as a result of that, they become slight adherents and defenders of their position of privilege. And that means, on the one hand, defending imperialism, on the other hand, trying to keep others out who might try and get to your privileged position by immigrating. So, and that goes along with all of these ideas that we've been talking about. So on immigration and emigration, Lenin said a clear difference of opinion arose between the opportunists and revolutionaries in the commission of the Stuttgart Congress. The opportunists cherished the idea of limiting the right of migration of backward, underdeveloped workers, especially, at that time, the Japanese and Chinese. In the minds of these opportunists, the spirit of narrow craft isolation, of trade union exclusiveness, outweighed the consciousness of socialist tasks. The work of educating and organising those strata of the proletariat which have not yet been drawn into the labour movement. The Congress rejected everything that smacked of this spirit. Even in the Commission, there were only a few solitary votes in favour of limiting freedom of migration, and the resolution adopted by the International Congress is permeated with the recognition of the solidarity of workers of all countries in the class struggle, something that really we've taken huge steps back from even today, and we're talking about over 100 years ago that they were able to see the real meaning of the bourgeois policy on immigration. I want to actually quote this resolution in full, which is the resolution on militarism. It's not really long, but it's really worth reading, because again and again when it actually came to war and the policy that people really pursued, Lenin was the only one who fearlessly stated, look, this is what we said, this is what we've agreed. People were afraid. They shunned, in his words, the resolution as the thief shuns, the scene of his crime, really, because they didn't want to be reminded of the very clear words that they were now reneging upon. So this is the resolution on militarism that came from the 12th Stuttgart Congress of the Second International. So the resolution, which was finally carried unanimously by both the Commission and nearly 900 delegates of all countries, expresses in vigorous terms the gigantic upswing of the revolutionary labour movement since the last International Congress. That was his feeling at the time. And here's the full resolution. So, the Congress confirms the resolutions adopted by previous international congresses against militarism and imperialism, and declares once more that the struggle against militarism cannot be separated from the socialist class struggle in general. Wars between capitalist states are, as a rule, the outcome of their competition on the world market, for each state seeks not only to secure its existing markets, but also to conquer new ones. In this, the subjection of foreign peoples and countries plays a prominent role. These wars result, furthermore, from the incessant race for armaments by militarism, one of the chief instruments of bourgeois class rule and of the economic and political subjection of the working class. Wars are favoured by the national prejudices which are systematically cultivated among the civilized peoples in the interest of their ruling classes, for the purpose of distracting the proletarian masses from their own class tasks, as well as from their duties of international solidarity. Wars, therefore, are part of the very nature of capitalism. They will cease only when the capitalist system is abolished, or when the enormous sacrifices in men and money required by the advance in military technique and the indignation called forth by armaments drive the peoples to abolish this system. For this reason, the proletariat, which contributes most of the soldiers and makes most of the material sacrifices, is a natural opponent of war, which contradicts its highest goal, the creation of an economic order on a socialist basis, which will bring about the solidarity of all peoples. The Congress therefore considers it as the duty of the working class, and particularly of its representatives in the parliaments, to combat the naval and military armaments with all their might, characterizing the class nature of bourgeois society and the motive for the maintenance of national antagonisms, and to refuse the means for these armaments. Refuse the means for these armaments really means wherever you have the ability to stop their production, do so. Wherever you have the ability to vote in Parliament against credits for war, against building up war, against initiating war, to do so is kind of self-evident, isn't it? It was far-reaching. It is their duty to work for the education of the working class youth in the spirit of the brotherhood of nations and of socialism, while developing their class consciousness. The Congress sees in the democratic organization of the army, meaning mass conscription, in the substitution of the militia for the standing army, an essential guarantee that offensive wars will be rendered impossible and the overcoming of national antagonisms facilitated. Something that's not possible, obviously, under capitalism. The International is not able to determine in rigid forms the anti-militarist actions of the working class, which are naturally different in different countries and for different circumstances of time and place. But it is its duty to coordinate and increase to the utmost the efforts of the working class against the war. In fact, since the International Congress at Brussels, the proletariat has employed the most diverse forms of action, with increasing success in its indefatigable struggles against militarism, by refusing the means for naval and military armaments and by its efforts to democratize the military organization, all for the purpose of preventing the outbreak of wars or for putting a stop to them, as well as for utilizing the convulsions of society caused by war for the emancipation of the working class. This was evidence, so this is still the resolution, this was evidence especially by the agreement between the English and French trade unions following the Fashoda affair for the maintenance of peace and for the restoration of friendly relations between England and France. Does everyone know what the Fashoda affair is?
It was the incident that place in Africa, where the French and the British army met at a certain point, and it was considered that we had to fight. At the last moment, the French commanding his army, blinked first, and it ended up with a handshake victory of the English side and some nice whiskey or wine, whatever they were drinking.
That's basically right. Did you all get that? So essentially, Africa was after the Berlin Congress, the territories were pretty much drawn up and divided between the great imperial powers. France had a dream of a band, colonising a band across Africa, east to west. Britain was trying to colonise a band north to south, and their colonial expeditions in Fashoda, which I think was in Sudan. I'm not absolutely sure. I think it was in Sudan. They basically met in this place as their expedition, and both empires kind of then mobilised diplomatically to kind of war. So there were rumblings that there would be war between the two greatest imperial powers at the time, and ultimately, if you like, the French blinked first, and the English, using their overwhelming military and naval might, were able to get the French to back down. Okay. It means to march. Okay, fine. So, but at that time there was obviously some international cooperation between the French and British trade unions, which was particularly alluded to as being an example of the way to proceed. So, the Fashoda affair.
What year was that Fashoda incident?
Not sure. So,
1898.
The Fashoda affair for the maintenance of peace and for the restoration of friendly relations between England and France. By the procedure of the social democratic parties in the German and French parliaments during the Morocco crisis. You know what the Morocco crisis? So the Morocco crisis was, and Morocco again was principally under French Spanish semi-control, and the Germans in their period of trying to expand empire had gone there. So the Kaiser Wilhelm had dropped in and ridden round. He'd rode around the city on a white horse and kind of made rumblings that he was going to have a rapprochement with a local ruler, the Sultan, and that again caused a similar colonial wrangle between the big colonial powers.
That one in 1905.
Yes, Dan, thank you. 1905. The demonstrations arranged by the French and German socialists for the same purpose. The concerted action of the socialists of Austria and Italy, who met in Trieste in order to prevent a conflict between the two countries. Furthermore, by the energetic intervention of the socialist workers of Sweden in order to prevent an attack upon Norway. Finally, the heroic self-sacrificing struggle of the socialist workers and peasants of Russia and Poland in order to oppose the war unleashed by Tsarism, to put a stop to it, and to utilise the crisis of the country for the liberation of the working class. All these efforts are evidence of the growing power of the proletariat and of its increasing ability to secure the maintenance of peace by resolute intervention. The action of the working class will be all the more successful the more that its spirit is prepared by a corresponding action, and the labour parties and the various countries are spurred on and coordinated by the International. The Congress is convinced that under the pressure of the proletariat, by a serious use of arbitration in place of the miserable measures of the governments, the benefit of disarmament can be secured to all nations, making it possible to employ the enormous expenditures of money and energy which are swallowed up by military armaments and wars for cultural purposes to improve people's lives. If a war threatens to break out, it is the duty of the working classes and their parliamentary representatives in the countries involved, supported by the coordinating activity of the International Socialist Bureau, i.e. the International, to exert every effort in order to prevent the outbreak of war by the means they consider most effective, which naturally vary according to the sharpening of the class struggle and the sharpening of the general political situation. In case war should break out anyway, it is their duty to intervene in favour of its speedy termination, and with all their powers to utilise the economic and political crisis created by the war to rouse the masses and thereby to hasten the downfall of capitalist class rule. So really, an incredibly revolutionary declaration that declared peace amongst workers, that said workers have no interest in shooting down their brother workers for the interests of the capitalists, that pointed out the imperialist machinations economically and politically that were driving to war, that said actually we want to do everything we possibly can to intervene to stop war, to stop these millions of deaths that are clearly going to be caused. But in the event that war does break out, that we wouldn't confine ourselves to pacifist resolutions, that we would use this crisis created to hasten the overthrow of capitalism and bring into being a socialist system of economy, rule of the workers, so that actually the wealth of the workers can be used to better the lives of workers. So really this was hailed, as a great victory by the revolutionary wing of social democracy, and it was. And it was revisited and recapitulated to an extent by the next Congress, which was the 1912 Congress at Bao. Basel? Bao.
Ball
I say Bao. But
In Switzerland,
in
Basel
Challenge.
for us.
yeah.
French is Ball and the German is Basel.
So I still don't know. Bao. It's a very long resolution, and I'm not going to read it all. But by that point, there was already a crisis in the Balkans, which kind of had it was a national liberation struggle, if you like, of the Balkans against the. They were then occupied by the Turkish, by the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarians in different parts. But around that, the great powers were manoeuvring towards the Great War more and more. And it was quite clear that despite what small element of national democratic content there might be for the Serbs themselves, the overwhelming message of the war was going to be precisely as it had been laid out and defined by the previous Congresses. It was an inter-imperialist war. And I'll read at least excerpts from the manifesto of the Bao resolution to you. How long has that been, Ella? Hours.
No, because of that.
Fine. So I'll read a bit more. So, at its Congress at Stuttgart and Copenhagen, referring to its previous resolutions, the International formulated for the proletariat of all countries these guiding principles for the struggle against war. If the war threatens to break out, it's the duty of the working classes and their parliamentary representatives in the countries involved, supported by the coordinated activity of the International Socialist Bureau, to exert every effort in order to prevent the outbreak of war by the means they consider most effective. In case war should break out anyway, it's their duty to intervene in favour of its speedy termination, and with all their powers to utilise the economic and political crisis created by the war to arouse the people and thereby to hasten the downfall of capitalist class rule. So really, it's a recapitulation of the final two most salient paragraphs of the previous resolution. More than ever, recent events have imposed upon the proletariat the duty of, and this is in 1912, of 2 years before, a year and a half before the war is going to break out. This is in November. More than ever, recent events have imposed upon the proletariat the duty of devoting the utmost force and energy to planned and concerted action. On the one hand, the universal craze for armaments has aggravated the high cost of living, thereby intensifying class antagonisms and creating in the working class an implacable spirit of revolt. The workers want to put a stop to this system of panic and waste. On the other hand, the incessantly recurring menace of war has a more and more inciting effect. The great European peoples are constantly on the point of being driven against one another, although these attempts are against humanity and reason and cannot be justified by even the slightest pretext of being in the interest of the people. If the Balkan crisis, which has already caused such terrible disasters, should spread further, it would become the most frightful danger to civilization and the proletariat. At the same time, it would be the greatest outrage in all history because of the crying discrepancy between the immensity of the catastrophe and the significance of the insignificance of the interests involved, i.e. those of a tiny number of propertied individuals. It is with satisfaction that the Congress records the complete unanimity of the socialist parties and the trade unions of all countries in the war against war. The proletarians of all countries have risen simultaneously in a struggle against imperialism. Each section of the International has opposed the resistance of the proletariat to the government of its own country and has mobilized the public opinion of its nation against all bellicose desires. Thus there resulted the grandiose cooperation of the workers of all countries, which has already contributed a great deal towards saving the threatened peace of the world the fear of the ruling class of a proletarian revolution as a result of World War has proved to be an essential guarantee of peace. The Congress therefore calls upon the social democratic parties to continue their action by every means that seems appropriate to them. In this concerted action, it assigns to each socialist party its particular task. And then it goes into a great deal about the duties of the Social Democratic Party of the Balkans in their conflict, not to incite any national hatred or chauvinism against the other participants, despite some of their legitimate demands and struggles. The Social Democratic Parties of Austria, Hungary, Croatia and Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina are to continue with all their power their effective action against the attack upon Serbia by the Danubian monarchy, by their own ruling class. It is their task to continue, as in the past, to oppose the plan of robbing Serbia. Social democratic parties of Austria-Hungary will also fight in order that those sections of the South Slavic people ruled by the House of Habsburg may obtain the right to govern themselves democratically within the boundaries of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy proper. Talks about Italy and the Albanian question very specifically. The Congress called upon the Social Democrats of Austria-Hungary and Italy to combat every attempt of their governments to envelop Albania. It is with great joy that the Congress greets the protest strikes of Russian workers as a guarantee that the proletariat of Russia and of Poland is beginning to recover from the blows dealt it by the Tsarist counter-revolution. When Tsarism now tries to appear as the liberator of the Balkan nations, it is only to reconquer its hegemony in the Balkans in a bloody war under this hypocritical pretext. Again, I'm missing sections. However, the most important task, the resolution states, within the action of the International devolves upon the working class of Germany, France, and England. And sadly, it was Germany, France, and England who proved least equal to the task that the International set them. At this moment, it is the task of the workers of these countries to demand of their governments that they refuse any support either to Austro-Hungary or Russia, that they abstain from any intervention in the Balkan troubles and maintain absolute neutrality. A war between the three great leading civilized peoples on account of the Serbo-Austrian dispute over a port would be criminal insanity. The workers of Germany and France cannot concede that any obligation whatever to intervene in the Balkan conflict exists because of secret treaties, i.e. the pledge of their government that they didn't dare to share with their people at the time, and of course which the Soviet government published after the revolution. They published all the secret treaties and agreements which proved their assertion that this war precisely was about division of spoils, division of slaves, division of markets, conquest of new territories, of which again imperialism never forgave them. However, on further development, should a military collapse of Turkey lead to the downfall of Ottoman rule in Asia Minor, it would be the task of the socialists of England, France and Germany to resist with all their power the policy of conquest in Asia Minor, which would inevitably lead in a straight line to war. The Congress views as the greatest danger to the peace of Europe the artificially cultivated hostility between Great Britain and the German Empire. The overcoming of the antagonism between Germany on the one hand and France and England on the other would eliminate the greatest danger to peace of the world, shake the power of Tsarism, which exploits this antagonism, render an attack on Austro-Hungary upon Serbia impossible, and secure peace to the world. All the efforts of the International, therefore, are to be directed towards this goal. The Congress records that the entire Socialist International is unanimous upon these principles of foreign policy. It calls upon the workers of all countries to oppose the power of the international solidarity of the proletariat to capitalist imperialism. It warns the ruling classes of all states not to increase by belligerent actions the misery of the masses brought on by the capitalist method of production. It emphatically demands peace. Let the governments remember that with the present condition of Europe and the mood of the working class, they cannot unleash a war without danger to themselves. Let them remember that the Franco-German War was followed by the revolutionary outbreak of the Commune in 1870-1871. That the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 set into motion the revolutionary energies of the peoples of the Russian Empire, that the completion in military and naval armaments gave the class conflicts in England and on the continent an unheard of sharpness and unleashed an enormous wave of strikes. It would be insanity for the governments not to realise that the very idea of the monstrosity of a world war would inevitably call forth the indignation and the revolt of the working class. The proletarians consider it a crime to fire at each other for the profits of the capitalists, the ambitions of dynasties, or the greater glory of secret diplomatic treaties. And I'll skip to the final paragraph. The Congress therefore appeals to you, proletarians and socialists of all countries, to make your voices heard in this decisive hour. Proclaim your will in every form and in all places. Raise your protest in the parliaments with all your force. Unite in great mass demonstrations. Use every means that the organisation and the strength of the proletariat place at your disposal. See to it that the governments are constantly kept aware of the vigilance and passionate will for peace on the part of the proletariat. To the capitalist word of exploitation and mass murder, oppose in this way the proletarian word of peace and fraternity of peoples. So quite beautiful, strongly worded, powerful, insightful, all-embracing policy of action given to workers of all countries in cooperation, and given the prestige of each of these quite significant national socialist parties, not national socialists of Nazis, socialist parties of each nation, giving them its support. So, to summarize, as Lenin put it, what do these really mean? Let us consider the substance of the argument that the authors of the Basel Manifesto sincerely expected the advent of a revolution, but were betrayed by the events. The Basel Manifesto says 1. War will create an economic and political crisis. 2. The workers view their participation in the war as a crime, and as criminal any shooting each other down for the profit of the capitalists, for the sake of dynastic honour and diplomatic secret treaties, and that the war evokes indignation and revolt in the workers. Said 3, therefore, it's the duty of socialists to take advantage of this crisis and the workers' temper so as to rouse the people and hasten the downfall of capitalism. 4, that all governments without exception can start a war only at their own peril. 5, that governments are afraid of a proletarian revolution. And 6, that governments should remember the Paris Commune and the 1905 revolution, etc. All these, he said, were perfectly clear ideas. They don't guarantee that a revolution will occur and succeed, but they lay stress on precise characterization of facts and trends and indicate the way forward for each of the parties involved. So what happened? War did come to fruition. War broke out on August the 4th, 1914, and it precipitated an immediate split in the within the socialist camp. And we can briefly examine the events and their demarcation, which we've really mentioned in the preamble and introduction. So Lenin said, the experience of war, like the experience of any crisis in history, of any great calamity and any sudden turn in human life, stuns and breaks some people, but enlightens and tempers others. And really, that was the effect of the actual outbreak of war on the Second International. The German Social Democrats leaders, in particular one who's earned infamy, called Albert Sudekum, met then with the Chancellor of the German Empire on the day that war was declared, and essentially agreed not to oppose the war with him. They might still pay lip service to Jean Jaurès and his Socialist International meeting, but as far as the German Chancellor is concerned, they had been neutralised. And on the day Germany and Austro-Hungary declare war, on August 4th, 1914, the German Social Democratic Party voted for war credits. So voted for money for the conduct of the war, so the actual starting of the war, unanimously. In fact, it turns out there are a group of 15 among the about 80 or 90 delegates. So they were serious. They were a minority, but they were the second largest party in the parliament, and they went along with it. There were a group of 15 who were relatively revolutionary perspective who were against it. But in particularly Liebknecht was against it, and on the second vote for war credits, which was at the end of that year, he was the only person to vote against the granting of further war credits. But after discussion, they submitted to the majority. And really, that was the end of the Second International, with actual war being fought, with the socialist parties. France went likewise, voted for war credits. Britain, the Labour Party, didn't vote for war credits, but they issued from their National Executive Committee of the Labour Party the slogans for national unity and for business as usual were the two slogans. So absolutely of social chauvinism, as Lenin came to characterize it, of cooperation with their own bourgeoisie in the conduct of the war, and absolutely reneging on the very clear revolutionary aims and slogans laid out in their former declarations. The opportunists have violated the decisions of the Stuttgart, Copenhagen and Basel congresses, which imposed the duty on socialists of all countries to combat chauvinism in all and any conditions, made it binding on socialists to reply to any war begun by the bourgeoisie and their governments, with intensified propaganda of civil war and social revolution. The collapse of the Second International is the collapse of opportunism, which developed from the features of a past specific and so-called peaceful, relatively peaceful for the peoples of Europe, not peaceful in the sense that there was colonial war and conquest and domination and suffering of working people. So a relative, specific, peaceful historical period, and in recent years has come practically to dominate the international. The opportunists have long been preparing the ground for this collapse by denying the socialist revolution and substituting bourgeois reformism in its stead, by rejecting the class struggle with its inevitable conversion at certain moments into civil war, and by preaching class collaboration, by preaching bourgeois chauvinism under the guise of patriotism and the defense of the fatherland, and ignoring or rejecting the fundamental truth of socialism long ago set forth in the Communist Manifesto, that the working men have no nation. Tremendously powerful concept. Communist Engels said, we communists are accused of trying to do away with nations. And he said, actually, the working men have no nation. We cannot take for them what they do not have. Just as he said, we are accused of doing away with private property. He says, yes, your bourgeois private property, which exists for the 1/10 by its lack of existence for the 9/10. Again, we can't take away from working men what they do not have. So, that socialism long ago set forth in the Communist Manifesto that the working men have no country, by confining themselves in the struggle against militarism to a sentimental Philistine point of view, instead of recognizing the need for a revolutionary war by the proletariat of all countries against the bourgeoisie of all countries, by making a fetish of the necessary utilization of bourgeois parliamentarism and bourgeois legality, and forgetting that illegal forms of organization and propaganda are imperative at times of crisis. And you see it again and again. What is it? So Lenin looked not just for, the fact that individuals had betrayed their former words. He said, well, what is the social phenomenon that leads to this? And again, he came back to the point of view that it was imperialism. And how does imperialism do it? And really, it comes through this form of legalism. So if the German Social Democratic Party had built up its prestige, had 1 million members, had half the representatives in parliament, then actually, despite the fact that it's in opposition, that it's causing for a different, social order, the reality is there's certain, benefits that come from having a big organisation, a place in society, a professional organisation, a legal organisation that you fought for in former times. They actually had to fight through the anti-socialist law when they were threatened with illegality. They came through that with quite, a lot of spirit. But rather than evoke that spirit, have illegal forms of organisation, obviously, to preach for the revolutionary defeat of your own bourgeoisie in times of war is hard. It involves self-sacrifice, it involves real danger, it involves the possibility of arrest, of hanging, of imprisonment, of real penalties because the bourgeoisie ultimately has the state in its hand. But then to talk of revolution, not just to seriously, as a serious word, to believe in socialism and believe you're not going to have to come up against the armed might of the bourgeoisie is a total fraud. But the bottom line is, within these big socialist parties, there were whole groups of socialists who really had given up the idea, in practical terms, of struggling against the bourgeoisie, of overthrowing the bourgeoisie, and therefore when it came to it, they were more concerned with preserving their legal form, saying military censorship prevents us from raising the call for revolution. Well, of course, bourgeois legality prevents you from raising the cause of revolution, but these became the overwhelming factors. And actually, there were privileges involved of being from the great power, just from the fact that you were in a country exploited so much of the world's surface. England at this time, of course, still had an empire in which the sun never set, that covered two-thirds of the, two-thirds? It covered a third of the world's territory, a huge amount of the world's territory. And huge profits flowed to Britain, and the working class were relatively well off, and therefore its leadership and sections of the working class really did form an aristocracy of labour who, in a sense, had made an alliance with British imperialism. Hence the call for national unity. Hence, yes, we want the struggle for socialism, but all of that has to go on hold because there can be no question of socialism until we defeat the oppressive Kaiser. This was the kind of standard phraseology of the Labour Party, and sadly this was seen in France as well. So, Kautsky brought forth his own theory, which is worth touching upon at that time, which is of ultra-imperialism. So rather than openly preaching social chauvinism, he said, well, actually, imperialism doesn't have to be warlike. And he's saying this in the midst, not forget, of the biggest and bloodiest conflagration known to history at this time, when 40 million workers were being sacrificed and all the devastation it caused. But he said, actually, he started talking theoretically about, there's a slight lowering of the tariffs, import tariffs in Britain and America. And, this actually suggests that it's possible because of interlocking nature of capital, that you get one overriding capitalism which just administers things, yes, not in the interest of workers, but doesn't have to be bloody and brutal. And, and really, Lenin pointed out, this amounts to no more than a prayer to the bourgeoisie. While the bourgeoisie may have interlocking shares, the bottom line is they still had very separate groups of nations who quite clearly demonstrated their desire to redivide up the world. Now the world was completely divided amongst the imperialists. They could only conquer new territories by redividing it. And as one imperialist became strong, namely the German bloc, one relatively stagnant, namely the British and French, they fought over redivision of territories. And this was inevitable under imperialism. So this really amounted to the desertion to the social chauvinist, but under a kind of theoretical cloak. It wasn't something that actually can ever exist. Similarly, Trotsky put forward a theory that to call for the revolutionary defeat of your own government was itself social chauvinism, because the defeat of your own government implied the victory of another government. So the defeat of your own government is basically like calling for the defence of the fatherland. It was a kind of incredible sophistry. And Lenin said, Trotsky is tripping himself up with his own clever phraseology, but this is total rubbish as well. To call this reduces the question, he said, basically to the sphere of social pacifism, of saying neither victory nor defeat. So actually you want the status quo. So you want the preservation of the class rule of the bourgeoisie, which was actually the content of bourgeois pacifism as well. It was, we don't want the war, we don't want, we just hope for peace, ignoring the real driving factors that forced capitalist imperialism to go to war, and just praying for a peaceful world. And the reality, he said, was that was the content of Trotsky's slogan as well. Trotsky then, on the basis of that, said he called at a certain stage for a United States of Europe slogan, which is also debated. United States of Europe, again, at a time when the European states are knocking 7 shades out of each other, with all of the devastation that entails. And he said, yes, of course, agreement between imperialist states, temporary or relatively long-lasting, can't be overlooked. It's a possibility. But as long as they remain imperialist states, what does it mean? It means, as we said around the EU debate and the Brexit debate, this means imperialist states coming together for the suppression of their own proletariat at home and for the stronger exploitation of the colonies abroad. And he opposed to that, saying this basically ignores the question of, again, the proletarian revolution. And the only correct slogan that you can call for within the context of this is to turn the inter-imperialist war into a civil war, to call for the revolutionary defeat of your own government. And yes, that involves sacrifice. It's a hard thing to do when the jingoistic cry goes up. We all have seen in our time the jingoistic cry for war, whether it's the Iraq war or the Afghanistan war, or the jingoistic cries that happen when someone flies a plane into 9/11, or if you're a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, someone blows up the Twin Towers, whatever. The pressure that the bourgeoisie is able to exert through all its influence on the working masses is considerable, and quite clearly there are real pressures to exert. But the reason that it's much easier within the socialist camp, so if there was a party in which there's a revolutionary wing and a reformist wing, the reformist wing puts out its statements. And why was it that the whole party seemed to collapse in their favour? And Lenin pointed out, in a way that wasn't polite to point out, but you couldn't shy away from, this is because they have with them not just their words, not the force of argument, but they have the power of the bourgeoisie. They have the bourgeois state on their side. They had access to bourgeois media. The journals are thrown open to them. They can be in the Guardian and the Sun, and every propaganda and pulpit would be echoing their words and pointing out, well, this is a good example. This is how international socialism should proceed. These are the sensible international socialists. And conversely, if you actually call for a civil war, well, that's high treason. Well, you can be imprisoned, or hung, shot, not drawn and quartered, but you met with real punishments. Your legal avenues are closed to you. Your papers are shut down. But isn't this, he said, wasn't this the absolute betrayal of the right of the working people to revolution, which is the ultimate right that socialists have to invoke? If they're Marxist socialists, if they're revolutionary socialists, they're ultimately, what you stand for is the right of the working people to overthrow capitalism. And if you're prepared to submerge that right for the sake of your own hide, for the sake of your own organisation, for the legal advantages, and you may have spent 20, 30 years building up that legal party. But if when it comes to it, at the moment of crisis, at the moment when there's a real revolutionary situation possible, you throw it all away, then you've absolutely betrayed the cause. And it was very impolite. But Lenin on this basis said, look, there's this obsessive opportunism which has been festering in the working class movement, and it's reached full maturity with the war. And the war has brought into a new class alliance, if you like, brought it between the bourgeoisie proper, between various pressmen and petty bourgeois, and between the opportunist wing of social democracy, which has transformed and solidified it into social imperialism. And social imperialism became the dominant theme of the socialist movement, of the Labour Party, of even the Communist Party in France, to an extent, certainly the right wing of it, of the German social democratic movement for many years, and leading towards the Second World War. And it is still that Labour Party that we contend with in this country, that was raised in those traditions, which has carried on fighting in those traditions. I've got many more beautiful quotes of Lenin that I'm probably not going to read to you.
Maybe they'll come up in discussion.
They might come up in discussion, but it's worth just pointing out that having set the scene for the formation of the Labour Party in this way, and I really like you all, if you haven't already got it, to consider getting this book. It is written by someone in the room, so I'm sorry to plug it. but it's the fundamental task we've got now of getting I'm quite inspired by the latest election result in a way, given the political situation. Without any influence from us, people are kind of rejecting the status quo. They're fed up of 10 years of austerity, of their worsening situation. Still, if you go on the streets, you see how privileged our working class is, and the real effect that an economic privilege has in divorcing people from facing revolutionary struggle. No one wants to go through the sacrifice of a revolution if it's not necessary. But ultimately, this imperialist system generates crisis after crisis and drags working people through, to their deaths, right? By their tens and hundreds of millions annually in other countries. But even in the heartlands of imperialism, periodically with crisis, it's quite clear that there's a current drive through the economic destruction of this latest capitalist imperialist economic crisis towards increased militarism, towards confrontation with Russia and China, towards renewed war, that these things are real, that they will come in our lifetime if we're unable to avert them. It's worth going back to those resolutions, quite powerful resolutions of the Second International, which were honoured in the breach rather than the observance, to realise these are still the questions which dominate our movement today. And we might seem very far divorced from them, but if we don't help young working class Britons who are very ill served actually by the system, even in the heartland of imperialism, to appreciate that there is another option apart from just servility before the bourgeoisie and acceptance that the system will just tick on and your socialist representatives will basically try and get you a couple of pennies more on the pound, and that's the limit of the action that you can have. It's possible to enter on a revolutionary path, to start organising and mobilising, to genuinely put the question of overthrowing capitalist imperialism and building a system of humanity, a system of economy that serves the vast masses of humanity. It's a crime and a travesty that 5 people today have as much as half the world's population in terms of their economic resource. It's a crime and a travesty that billions upon billions of people, live on $1 or $2 a day, half the world's population. That 1 billion of people don't have their housing needs met, that 1 billion people don't have access to clean water, that 1 billion people don't have enough nutrition when the world produces 5 or 6 more times food more than is necessary to feed the entire population, that more is spent on armaments than it would take to actually solve the world's problem of development. All of these are incredible statistics that are based upon the parasitic excrescence, that is the imperialist system that allows a few to live at the expense of the vast masses of humanity. And really, this question of reform or revolution, these forgotten words of socialism, where the correct path to a socialist system was penned fully 100 years ago, are lessons that we need to revisit again and again and put in a modern light so that we can understand them and really create a new basis for the working class movement in this country, which will break away from this stifling fake left who surround the Labour Party, encourage parliamentary cretinism, who say the only way forward is through Parliament, that there can be no other movement, that all we can do is sign early day motions and appeal to our MPs and appeal to our betters. All of it leads to nothing. We have to start mobilising directly amongst working people, bringing them a correct class understanding, and truly I believe it's possible for us to build another world and have a significant impact upon that struggle. So thank you for listening to me. I think it was worth revisiting. Sure.